The Drayton orchard stretched across the gentle hills of rural Pennsylvania, like a painted promise of prosperity, each tree heavy with ripening fruit, each branch casting long shadows in the evening sun. From the outside, the Draytons were a family of quiet industriousness. Their red-bricked farmhouse tidy, their fields immaculate, their smiles as practiced and polished as the brass doorknobs that gleamed in the hallways. Neighbors nodded politely at passing wagons and carriages, exchanged pleasantries about harvests and the weather, and admired the twins, Lyle and Maren, who skipped across the orchard paths hand in hand, their laughter light and unthreatening. No one suspected that beneath the rich soil and the thick roots of those apple trees, there was a carefully buried secret that could twist the mind, that could warp innocence into a deliberate and studied form of cruelty. The house itself seemed almost alive with quiet purpose, each room arranged not merely for comfort, but for observation, for control, for subtle instruction in a discipline the outside world could not comprehend. In the pantry, knives were arranged not only for use but as instruments of demonstration, their edges polished to a reflective sheen that caught the candlelight and glimmered like something alive, waiting. In the attic, the boards creaked not under age, but under the deliberate placement of heavy objects meant to test balance, endurance, and perception in ways that seemed natural to the children, as if the house itself were shaping their minds. And in the basement, an iron trapdoor led down to a hollowed chamber dug long before the twins could remember, a chamber whose purpose was never spoken aloud, whose floor was worn with meticulous care, its walls inscribed with numbers, symbols, and diagrams only the Draytons understood. Here, in this subterranean sanctuary, the family's private logic played out, measurements of fear, calculations of obedience, rituals that combined superstition, medical curiosity, and a devotion to a personal moral code incomprehensible to outsiders. The twins, still small, were carefully guided to learn the patterns, to anticipate the lessons, to find fascination in the mechanical movements of fear itself. To the townsfolk, their household seemed the perfect image of normalcy, a model of prosperity and kindness. The orchard bloomed in spring. The wind carried the scent of fruit and pollen, and yet under the roots, beneath the mulch, and behind the walls, something else thrived. It thrived in silence. It thrived in meticulous, unobserved precision. The Draytons' obsession was not crude or impulsive. It was deliberate, systematic, a study of human response and a devotion to control that edged toward reverence. Night after night, the twins would awaken to faint murmurs, the rustle of papers, the clinking of glass. They learned the difference between accidental and intended sounds, between the ordinary noises of a household and the deliberate cadence of ritual. Each night, the family performed their quiet examinations, recording, observing, noting minute reactions, sometimes testing boundaries with cold instruments or subtle threats that required no words. The children never questioned, because questioning was itself part of the lesson, a lesson that measured curiosity, obedience, and emotional resilience. The orchard's beauty was a mask, the farmhouse's warmth a cloak, and the family's laughter a thin veil over a darker symmetry that had been cultivated for years. Even as the sun rose and neighbors admired the ordered rows of fruit trees, the shadows beneath the roots shifted with careful intent, a reminder that evil does not always announce itself with noise or violence, but often in the precise choreography of the ordinary. Beneath the orchard, the Draytons' world existed in parallel, one of smiling faces and gentle routines, another of rituals and obsessions hidden behind locked doors, behind false walls, behind the very image of domestic perfection. And in that hidden world, the seeds of methodical horror were planted, nurtured and allowed to grow in silence, waiting for the world outside to turn its eyes elsewhere, to remain oblivious, to mistake prosperity for innocence, and to never see what actually lay beneath the orchard's fruitful soil. Lyle and Maren moved through their days like reflections of the world the townsfolk wished to see, bright-eyed, curious, and unthreatening. They skipped along the orchard paths, chased sunlight across the farmhouse walls, and giggled over games that seemed ordinary, charming, almost effortless. Visitors were drawn to their laughter, to the way the twins leaned close to one another in whispered conspiracies that sounded like shared secrets rather than hidden terrors. To anyone passing by, the children were fragile blossoms, delicate in manner and trusting in heart, a picture of innocence that invited care rather than suspicion. Yet this facade, so carefully maintained, was only one side of their existence. Behind closed doors, the Draytons shaped their children with quiet, relentless precision, teaching them lessons in obedience, observation, and the subtle mechanics of fear. The twins learned to anticipate pain before it arrived, to feel the weight of a stare or the slightest shift in a tone and know what would come next. Laughter and tenderness in public were rehearsed, a performance that concealed hours of ritualized instruction in private. The lessons were never cruel without reason. Each measured, recorded, and analyzed. A misplaced step, a wavering glance, or a delayed response was met not with anger, but with an exacting correction that demanded reflection and recalibration. The twins became their own observers, cataloging sensations, mapping reactions, internalizing discipline, and learning the language of compliance in silence. The Draytons taught more than fear. They taught the twins to navigate the thin line between natural human emotion and the restrained detachment required by their home. The children's minds became mirrors of the household itself, reflecting normalcy outward while absorbing its darker rhythms inward. Friends from the village occasionally visited, and the twins delighted in their attention, performing the expected gestures of politeness and charm. Yet behind smiles, each movement was carefully calculated, a rehearsal of behavior that hid the lessons carved into their psyche. Even simple acts, pouring tea, handing over a basket of apples, greeting neighbors, were exercises in subtle control, exercises that strengthened their ability to separate outward innocence from internal comprehension of the unnatural. There were games the twins played among themselves, ones that mimicked the patterns they witnessed from the adults. Precision, timing, subtle mimicry of ritual movements. To outsiders, these seemed like harmless child's play, yet the Draytons had trained them to encode observation and response into every motion, teaching them to read gestures and anticipate outcomes with unnerving accuracy. Lyle, though younger by minutes, learned to watch, to note, to predict, while Maren absorbed lessons in patience, endurance, and the quiet acceptance of the household's rules. Their bond, ordinary to all observers, became a shared understanding of a world that operated on layers. One visible, cheerful, and benign. Another hidden, disciplined, and mercilessly structured. Even the smallest of missteps in public, hesitation in a handshake, a delayed smile, could trigger a subtle correction back home, a reminder of the structure governing their minds. The duality of their existence grew heavier with each passing year. At the surface, they embodied childhood perfection. Beneath, they navigated a labyrinth of expectation, ritual, and psychological shaping. Townsfolk commented on the children's manners, on their apparent empathy, on their sweetness, never realizing that every outward gesture was the product of an education in methodical observation and emotional control. They were being trained not to reveal themselves, not to betray the household's secrets, not even to their own sense of self. And yet, even under the weight of such silent conditioning, the twins retained traces of natural curiosity, fleeting sparks of untainted thought that flickered like fireflies in the dark corners of their minds. Those moments of genuine wonder, of unplanned laughter, were brief and carefully contained, yet they reminded the Draytons that the machinery of their household had not entirely extinguished what it sought to dominate. The adults' approach to shaping the children was methodical, almost clinical, a blend of ritual and observation. Every meal, every chore, every moment of play contained potential instruction, a chance to teach measurement, response, or endurance. The twins learned to anticipate the rhythm of fear and expectation as easily as they learned to count steps along the orchard rows. To outsiders, Lyle and Maren were ordinary, even ideal children. To themselves, they were students in a school whose lessons were unending, whose curriculum was defined by the hidden mind of the family who bore their name. The subtle horrors of their education, the quiet manipulations, the rituals that measured psychological response, the shaping of emotion itself, went unnoticed beyond the farmhouse walls. Each day, the twins wore their innocence like a mask, a protective shell that concealed not just fear, but understanding, not just compliance, but participation in the household's unseen order. The paradox of their lives was clear only to the Draytons and perhaps to the twins themselves, a perfection of appearance that hid an interior landscape of discipline, observation, and slow psychological shaping. And so, the children moved through the world, seemingly sweet, seemingly fragile, carrying the echo of lessons no one could see, no one could guess, and no one could stop. They were the living embodiment of the duality their home demanded, innocence as armor, sweetness as disguise, a facade that allowed the shadow within the orchard to thrive, to deepen, and to remain entirely unnoticed. Night in the Drayton farmhouse carried a weight no neighbor could sense, a stillness that settled over the orchard and fields like a shroud, masking the deliberate activity within. While the world outside slept, the house itself seemed to breathe, rooms illuminated by the faint glow of lanterns, shadows stretching and shrinking across walls as if alive. In the twins' bedroom, strange symbols had been etched with careful precision on plaster and wood. Circles intersecting lines, patterns that seemed meaningless to an outsider, yet each carried a lesson, a test, a command written in a language of fear and order. The twins lay in bed, eyes wide, bodies tense yet silent. Their parents moved through the room, not as caretakers, but as orchestrators of a methodical ritual, teaching control through observation and deliberate consequence. Every gesture, every whisper, every slight adjustment of posture carried intention. A soft chant filled the corners of the room, barely audible, as if meant to teach the children attention through their very need to strain to hear. The chant was a rhythm, a cadence, a guide to patience and endurance. Lyle and Maren were expected to note its rise and fall, to recognize the unspoken meanings, to anticipate the motion of hands, the turn of steps, the inevitable correction that followed any misalignment. Objects were arranged on shelves and tables according to a hidden order. Candles were placed not merely to illuminate but to draw the eye, to create focus, to serve as markers for exercises that tested perception and reaction. A mirror angled in the corner reflected not the children themselves, but the room in fragments, a visual puzzle designed to teach vigilance and disorientation simultaneously. The twins learned quickly that every pattern had consequence. A misplaced foot, a hesitation in gesture, or even a faltering glance could earn a silent admonition. The shifting of a hand across a wall, the subtle tapping of a foot on the floor, the cold brush of a parent's palm on the wrist, small, almost imperceptible, yet capable of sending a wave of fear that resonated through the body and mind alike. There were nights when the rituals became exercises in endurance. The twins were asked to hold positions that tested balance and flexibility, to maintain focus on flickering shadows, to listen to faint sounds and respond without drawing attention to themselves. Each action was observed, catalogued, noted in journals that lined the shelves, journals filled with careful handwriting that recorded heartbeats, fidgets, involuntary flinches, and micro-expressions. The parents rarely spoke in the conventional sense. Communication was quiet, ritualized, almost ceremonial. Each instruction, each correction was delivered as a part of the choreography. The twins internalized these movements, these expectations, until their bodies responded before thought, until fear and obedience became intertwined with identity. The household objects themselves became instruments. A simple wooden chair was moved into the center of the room, its legs aligned precisely with markings on the floor, a silent test of patience and compliance. A small bell, struck sparingly, was enough to redirect attention, to measure reflex, to teach anticipation. The twins understood that every item, every shadow, every sound carried instruction. Even the furniture seemed complicit in the lessons, and the very walls of the room whispered with meaning. The horror of these rituals was not loud, not sudden, not dramatic. It was slow, insidious, and persistent. It took root in ordinary spaces. The kitchen, where a slightly misplaced knife could provoke study. The hallways, where footsteps were counted and timed. The orchard, where lines in the dirt measured precision. At night, these exercises intensified, but no one outside would ever know. No scream pierced the walls, no sign of distress escaped the farmhouse. The twins were taught to mask discomfort, to appear serene, to learn control through concealment. And in this silence, the mind of the Draytons thrived. Their cruelty was not impulsive. It was deliberate, ritualistic, a slow cultivation of obedience, endurance, and understanding of fear as a tool. The twins were the recipients of a dark pedagogy, their minds shaped as carefully as the orchard's trees, trained to bend, adapt, and internalize. Each session ended not with relief, but with anticipation. Anticipation of repetition, of subtle escalation, of further refinement. In the shadows, the parents moved like conductors of a quiet symphony, orchestrating rhythm, tone, and timing. The twins' compliance was measured, their reactions catalogued, and the lessons adjusted for maximum efficacy. What might seem cruel in isolation was, to the Draytons, a study, an experiment, a way of understanding the human mind and its capacity to respond to structured fear. And yet, in the calm of the night, in the silence that blanketed the farmhouse, there was no visible suffering, no outward violence, only an ever-present tension that both anchored and constricted the twins' consciousness. The ordinary world outside continued undisturbed. Neighbors slept, unaware of the small, precise horrors that shaped the children they saw skipping along paths in the light of day. To an outsider, the Draytons' home appeared quiet, even peaceful, a model of domestic care. But beneath the surface, beneath the candlelight and the soft chants, beneath the lines and circles and mirrors, a far darker curriculum was in motion, invisible to the eyes of those who refused to look closer. Each night, as the lanterns dimmed and shadows merged with darkness, the twins learned the most fundamental lesson of all, that control, observation, and compliance could coexist with the illusion of innocence, that horror could thrive not in violence alone, but in order, in ritual, in the quiet discipline of the mind. And as sleep finally claimed them, the house exhaled, and the orchard outside swayed in the night wind, oblivious to the meticulous, ritualized shaping of two minds whose innocence would remain, at least outwardly, entirely unbroken. The lessons of the night evolved as the twins grew, moving from subtle rituals and observation into something far more deliberate, something that tested not just patience, but the very boundaries of body and mind. The Draytons' home, which appeared ordinary and orderly to anyone outside, had been quietly transformed into a laboratory of fear. Hidden behind panels of furniture, beneath loose floorboards, in cupboards that appeared unused, lay devices of methodical cruelty, each constructed with care and each carrying a meaning known only to the family. These devices were not weapons in the conventional sense. There were no blades swinging with dramatic intent, no overt acts of violence meant to shock. Instead, they were instruments of calculation, each one designed to measure response, endurance, and submission. A small wheel embedded in a chair's arm could be turned to apply subtle pressure to a limb, forcing attention to the slow, creeping discomfort of flesh under mechanical stress. A series of cold metal plates arranged in an alcove behind a shuttered window allowed the twins' hands or feet to be subjected to ice-like temperatures, forcing them to observe their own reactions, to note the onset of pain and the subtle tremors that accompanied it. Every device was catalogued, every movement recorded, and each result fed back into the twins' understanding of control, of restraint, and of the precise balance between discomfort and compliance. The children were taught to measure themselves against these instruments, to note not only what they felt, but how they reacted internally, where anxiety began, how it spread, what muscles tensed, how the mind tried to escape through thought or denial. Pain became a language, fear became a lesson, and each session was both test and instruction. Lyle and Maren were aware that their parents watched, but the observation was never intrusive, never shouted or demanded. It was quiet, almost invisible, a presence felt in the tilt of a head, in the careful positioning of hands, in the way a shadow fell across the floor. Their education was psychological as much as physical. They learned that emotion could be dissected, that dread could be quantified, that instinct could be trained to obey. Even when they appeared calm, their bodies and minds were absorbing lessons about endurance, about anticipation, about the subtle differences between threat and instruction. The devices themselves carried symbolic weight. A small cage-like frame might seem simple, but its presence taught the twins about containment and surrender. A set of weights attached to a chair or footboard was more than exercise. It was a meditation on pressure, resistance, and the exact point at which discomfort became unbearable. To outsiders, these objects were innocuous, pieces of furniture, odds and ends of household utility, curiosities with no apparent meaning. But within the household, each item was a carefully calibrated instrument, part of a system of observation, of psychological mapping, of the methodical teaching of control. The Draytons' approach was almost scientific, measured, relentless. Each session followed a pattern, each lesson building upon the previous, designed to test limits, then expand them. Lyle and Maren learned to anticipate, to observe subtle cues in their parents' movements, to internalize instruction before it was delivered, to measure their own emotional responses as if they were objects to be studied rather than feelings to be experienced. And yet, the horror of these lessons was not always physical. Often, it was the anticipation of the instrument, the thought of what was coming, the mind's own construction of fear that was more devastating than any touch. The twins learned that dread could be harnessed, that expectation could be shaped, that the body could betray them even when the mind remained composed. Night after night, sessions concluded not with screams, not with outward pain, but with silent notes recorded in journals, symbols marked in hidden corners, careful observation of subtle reactions. The twins' understanding of themselves shifted. They learned to separate sensation from thought, fear from expression, compliance from desire. Each lesson added another layer to their understanding of the household's hidden logic, another step in the slow construction of minds that could navigate extreme discipline without revealing fracture. Even the smallest details were used. A chair slightly out of place, a lantern moved a few inches, a panel left slightly ajar. These were not accidents. They were lessons in vigilance, in the reading of environment, in the anticipation of consequence. Pain and fear were not random. They were deliberate, symbolic, and codified into a system that only the Draytons fully understood. And yet the twins did not simply endure. They participated, absorbing the methodical cruelty as instruction, learning to respond, to internalize, to anticipate. The household's order extended to every creak in the floor, every gust of wind through the orchard, every flicker of lantern light across the walls. Lyle and Maren were trained to see, to feel, to measure, and ultimately to become extensions of the household's hidden mind. The outside world remained blissfully unaware. Neighbors admired the children, noting their charm, their attentiveness, their seeming fragility. No sign of the mechanical lessons, no trace of the subtle instruments of fear ever appeared to anyone else. The Draytons' secret remained perfectly contained, thriving in plain sight. And within that quiet, precise world, the twins learned a lesson deeper than any physical pain, that fear could be taught, that obedience could be engineered, and that the mind could be shaped by quiet, deliberate cruelty just as effectively as the body. Each night ended as it began, with shadows in corners, faint hums of observation, and the careful rearrangement of the instruments that had silently measured their response. And as the twins finally closed their eyes, the Draytons cataloged every detail, each small reaction a line in the ongoing study of human fear, a lesson that would echo through their children's minds long after the instruments themselves were gone, long after the orchard bloomed in sunlight and the world outside remained entirely unaware. Beyond the familiar rooms of the Drayton farmhouse, past the hallways polished to quiet perfection, lay a chamber unlike any other, a space the family called quietly among themselves the Garden of Mirrors. At first glance it appeared simple, walls lined with glass, reflections doubling the dim glow of lantern light, the faint scent of polish mingling with the earthy odor of the orchard drifting through hidden vents. But once inside, the ordinary rules of perception dissolved. Mirrors angled toward one another created impossible corridors, reflections that bent and multiplied the body, the room, and the shadows, until the twins, or any visitor, could no longer trust what they saw. Every step seemed mirrored a dozen times, every gesture echoed back in variations that confused the mind, unspooled certainty, and eroded confidence. The Draytons introduced the twins to the space gradually. First, brief visits, guided by careful hands and soft instructions, teaching them to measure distance, to map angles, to navigate a labyrinth that was more psychological than physical. Over time, these lessons became exercises in attention and control, in understanding the way perception could deceive and fear could take root. The twins learned to distinguish subtle distortions, to anticipate where their reflection might move in ways impossible in the ordinary world, and to track shadows that had no source. But the chamber's design extended beyond instruction. When the Draytons brought outsiders, visitors who wandered too close to the family's hidden routines, the garden became a trap. A wanderer might step inside, following the polite guidance of a host, and soon find themselves disoriented, lost in a maze of light and reflection that twisted every familiar landmark into something strange, threatening, unknowable. Time stretched differently within the mirrors. A minute could feel like hours, footsteps echoed endlessly, and the body began to betray the mind. Panic crept silently, a measured, creeping thing. The Draytons observed from hidden vantage points, cataloging reactions with the same careful precision they applied to the twins' lessons. A tremor in the hands, a flicker of recognition, a widening of the eyes, each became data, evidence of how the mind processed fear when certainty itself was impossible. Some visitors stumbled upon reflections of themselves that moved independently, or perceived shapes that had no source, their own faces twisted in impossible angles across the glass. Others became trapped in small corridors formed by mirrors meeting at precise junctions, forced to confront the futility of movement, the futility of escape. The twins, by contrast, learned to navigate the garden with remarkable composure. Their steps were deliberate, their gaze precise, their understanding of the space nearly intuitive. They began to recognize the patterns of illusion, the subtle cues hidden in the alignment of glass, the micro-shifts that indicated a path forward. And yet, even they felt the subtle strain of uncertainty, the slow erosion of natural trust in the world, the creeping awareness that what was real and what was mirrored might never be separated completely. The garden was not designed merely to disorient. It was designed to teach patience, observation, and endurance. The mind, the Draytons understood, could be manipulated as surely as the body, and fear could be measured not only in reactions to pain, but in the way the mind responded when certainty dissolved. The chamber became a crucible for understanding the nature of perception, for observing despair born not of injury, but of confusion, not of threat, but of an impossibility woven into the simplest act of walking across a room. Shadows played across the glass in shifting shapes, flickers that might have been reflections or might have been imagined. The twins learned to catalog these, to separate truth from illusion, to anticipate and measure. To outsiders, the garden was merely a curiosity, a room filled with glass, nothing more. No sound escaped, no evidence of its effect remained, and the Draytons' secret continued to thrive behind the ordinary walls of their farmhouse. The chamber also held a symbolic function. The mirrors multiplied in fractured images, reminding the twins that identity itself could be observed, dissected, and reflected endlessly. Each shadow in the glass was a lesson in perception, each doubled corridor a test of mental resilience. Each encounter with disorientation, a reflection of the household's larger lesson, that fear, control, and understanding could exist together in subtle, invisible ways. Over time, even those trained within the chamber began to recognize its toll. A brief exposure left impressions that lingered long after stepping back into ordinary spaces. Movements felt slightly off, familiar paths suddenly unfamiliar, and the mind questioned what it had trusted for years. The twins learned that horror need not be overt to leave a mark. It could be slow, subtle, disorienting, and unforgettable. They understood that a room of mirrors was more than architecture. It was a study of human perception, a laboratory of the unseen, a lesson that would haunt memory long after the body had walked free. And as the lanterns dimmed and shadows merged into darkness, the Draytons observed silently, recording, calculating, and refining. They saw what terror looked like in the absence of violence, how despair could form in a mind confronted with the impossible, how control could be exerted with precision and patience rather than force. Outside, the orchard swayed in the night wind. Peaceful and ordinary, while within, the garden of mirrors preserved its quiet terror, shaping minds, fracturing perception, and leaving a mark that no visitor, no twin, and no observer would ever fully forget. To the people of the town, the Drayton farmhouse was nothing more than an orderly, prosperous home, yet faint whispers sometimes drifted through the night air, carried on the wind that rustled the orchard leaves. The sounds were subtle, almost imperceptible, a soft scraping across the floorboards, a quiet thump from the walls, a distant sigh that might have been the wind itself. Still, the whispers unsettled those closest to the property. Farmers passing the edge of the orchard occasionally paused, ears straining for meaning, but found nothing concrete. No evidence, no culprit, no cause. The town began to remember oddities and fragments. Mrs. Callahan's prized hen disappearing without trace. A small barn fire that charred only a corner of Mr. Willis's tool shed. Doors locked tight from the inside, though no key remained in the lock. Each incident seemed minor, almost dismissible, yet accumulated in a pattern that hinted at something beyond ordinary explanation. And yet, despite these irregularities, nothing overtly criminal was ever observed. No one could place blame, and the Draytons' impeccable reputation remained untouched. It was precisely this invisibility that gave the family a quiet satisfaction. Evil, they understood, did not always need to be grand, noisy, or indisputable. It thrived best when hidden, when it could operate in the mundane, when small acts of cruelty were dismissed as coincidence or the quirks of rural life. The twins, now older, became silent participants in this unseen world. They understood the power of absence, the control exerted not through force, but through what was left unspoken, unproven, and unobserved. They watched neighbors' expressions when they recounted strange happenings, noting the disbelief, the rationalizations, the subtle unease that lingered behind polite nods. Each sound, each unexplained occurrence became a lesson in the way fear could ripple outward without leaving a trace, the way dread could exist without evidence. Inside the farmhouse, the walls seemed almost alive with subtle intention. Floorboards creaked in patterns that mirrored the rhythms of the night. Pipes moaned faintly as if speaking in a language understood only by those attuned to the house's hidden pulse. Even ordinary objects seemed to participate. A rocking chair that shifted slightly when no one sat in it. A window that rattled in exact time with a distant clock. The faintest hint of movement in a curtain as though unseen eyes were observing. Lyle and Maren learned to interpret these signs as carefully as they had learned to navigate the Garden of Mirrors. Each whisper, each tremor, each flicker of light was a signal, a lesson, a small test of perception and composure. The Draytons reveled in the subtlety. They understood that the greatest fear was often not physical pain, but the awareness that something was wrong, that the world was not as safe or as orderly as it appeared. They orchestrated these minor disturbances with precision, ensuring that outsiders sensed unease without ever discovering cause, teaching the twins that power could be exercised invisibly, that dread could be a quiet, constant companion. The town, largely unaware, continued daily life while these shadows stretched across their routines. Farmers mentioned missing tools, animals gone, minor fires, small accidents, each explained away with a shrug, a superstition, a rationalization. Nobody knew to suspect the family behind the orchard. The Draytons were too careful, too meticulous, too ordinary in appearance to draw suspicion. The twins internalized the lessons of invisibility as they had learned every other household principle. They moved silently, observed constantly, and learned to operate without leaving traces. They began to understand the psychological weight of unseen actions, the subtle manipulation of attention, expectation, and perception. Every step, every movement in the home was calculated, rehearsed, measured against the backdrop of the unknown reactions of those beyond the walls. Evil, they learned, did not always need to announce itself. It could whisper in corners, rustle in floorboards, flicker in shadows, and still leave a mark that lingered long after those touched by it had returned to oblivion. The Draytons' influence extended even further, into the consciousness of the town, shaping how people thought about coincidence, chance, and normality. The twins began to perceive the invisible architecture of fear, a missing animal, a small fire, a locked door. Each was not random but deliberate, a demonstration of power over what could be seen and unseen, over what could be proven and what could only be suspected. Nights in the farmhouse remained alive with quiet ritual. Lanterns cast soft glows that revealed nothing. Footsteps echoed in measured cadence, and shadows shifted in patterns known only to the family. Lyle and Maren practiced patience, endurance, and observation as part of the household curriculum. They cataloged reactions, observed responses, and internalized the subtle language of power. No outward cruelty was necessary. Fear could be taught through the unknown, through absence, through deliberate hints that the world might not be as safe as it seemed. The twins became fluent in this language, able to read the invisible script of the home, to anticipate the reactions of outsiders, and to understand the precise mechanics of subtle terror. The orchard outside continued to sway peacefully in the night wind. The farmhouse appeared orderly and serene, and the town slept on, unaware of the undercurrent of fear flowing through the walls of the Drayton home. The power of silence, the artistry of invisibility, the cultivation of suspicion and unease, these were lessons that no outsider could measure, yet they left marks just as deep and lasting as any overt act of violence. And within the house, the Draytons observed, recorded and taught, content in the knowledge that their cruelty, though invisible, had already taken root in both the minds of their children and in the shadows that touched the town, leaving echoes that would not soon be forgotten. The Draytons' fascination with control and observation reached its apex in the form of the machines they designed, each one cold, deliberate, and precise in its purpose. These were not crude tools of pain meant to shock or terrify in the moment. They were instruments of measured suffering, meticulously crafted to examine the body's and mind's response to discomfort over time. The largest of these was a spinning apparatus that could suspend a limb, a chair, or even the body itself, and rotate it with unerring consistency. Movement was slow, rhythmic, almost hypnotic, the pace calibrated to prolong sensation while minimizing sudden injury. The twins and the occasional outsider brought into these spaces learned to anticipate the pattern of rotation, the gentle yet relentless pull, the subtle tension that crept along joints and sinew. The apparatus was a teacher, a recorder, a device through which the Draytons studied fear as a physical phenomenon and as an emotional state. Another device, smaller but no less exacting, was an ice chamber. Within its walls, cold permeated every surface. Hands, feet, or other extremities could be subjected to near-freezing temperatures, producing numbness that was deceptive in its cruelty. The body felt nothing, yet every nerve was alert, registering subtle pressure, every micro-movement interpreted by the mind as potential threat. The twins were taught to measure these sensations, to observe their own reactions, and to record internal fluctuations in endurance and attention. These machines were never operated without intention. Every rotation, every degree of chill, every application of mechanical force was part of a ritual. The Draytons treated the activation of their devices with solemnity, moving slowly, deliberately, as if conducting a ceremony. Candles were lit and extinguished in sequence, journals were consulted, symbols marked on the walls, and hands moved in synchronized gestures to set the instruments into motion. The twins watched closely, learning that precision and ritual could coexist, that pain could be orchestrated and studied, and that each human reaction could be measured with terrifying accuracy. Observation was central. The Draytons never rushed, never shouted, never demanded compliance with words alone. Instead, they relied on patterns, sequences, and rhythm. The spinning device taught anticipation, patience, and the slow accumulation of tension. The ice chamber taught endurance, alertness, and the understanding that numbness itself could be a trap for the senses. Each session was carefully recorded in journals, noting posture, micro-flinches, pupil dilation, and involuntary reactions, all of which fed back into the family's ongoing study of human response. Even the twins' play became intertwined with these mechanical lessons. Lyle and Maren were instructed to time their movements with the spinning device, to observe reflections in mirrors while subjected to ice, to internalize the interplay between sensation and anticipation. In this way, the devices became extensions of the household's pedagogy, part of the continuous training that blurred the line between normal childhood instruction and the cultivation of precise psychological control. The machines were also symbolic. The spinning apparatus represented the inexorability of consequence, the ice chamber, the inevitability of discomfort, even when outward appearances suggested calm. The Draytons believed that these lessons extended beyond physical pain, teaching the twins about resilience, observation, and the subtle art of controlling the self under duress. To outsiders, the household remained pristine. Furniture was arranged neatly, meals were served with care, and the twins appeared to skip and laugh through the orchard without a trace of the mechanical precision underlying their discipline. But within the confines of hidden rooms, behind false walls and shuttered panels, the machines hummed softly with purpose, shadows moving in rhythm with turning wheels and the slow drip of condensation. Lyle and Maren learned to observe not just the devices but the responses of those who were untrained, noting how fear manifested in posture, in hesitation, in slight tremors. Each response was catalogued, measured, and compared to previous encounters, a quiet study in the universality of dread and the personal ways the mind confronted control. The Draytons were methodical to a degree that bordered on reverence. They did not rush the process, did not permit chaos, did not allow improvisation beyond the limits they had defined. Pain was administered not as punishment but as instruction, as study, as ritual. Every movement of a limb, every flicker of expression, every subtle shiver was accounted for, observed, and reflected upon. Even in the mundane hours between sessions, the the twins internalized the lessons of mechanical devotion. They learned that control could be subtle, that observation could be continuous, and that fear and endurance could be orchestrated with precision, patience, and ritual. And though the world outside the farmhouse remained calm and ordinary, the hidden rooms were alive with the quiet hum of machines, the slow turning of wheels, the subtle cold of metal and ice, all working in harmony to shape minds that understood control, anticipation, and the complex architecture of fear in ways that would last a lifetime. In that silence, the Draytons were both creators and conductors, their instruments a study in discipline, endurance, and the horrifying beauty of mechanical precision. Every rotation, every chill, every small measured movement became a lesson the twins would carry with them forever. A lesson in the delicate, terrifying balance between pain, anticipation, and the control of self. By the time Lyle and Maren reached the edge of adolescence, the subtle architecture of their upbringing began to reveal its consequences. To the town, the twins remained models of composure and grace, walking the orchard paths with practiced smiles, greeting neighbors with polite attentiveness, laughing lightly as if untouched by anything dark. Yet beneath that surface, the mind told a different story, a fractured world of memory, sensation and observation, where laughter and terror were woven together into a pattern that neither could fully untangle. They remembered sunlight on orchard leaves, the innocent thrill of chasing shadows, the simple delight of wind brushing across their faces. But those moments of joy were inseparable from the memory of hidden lessons, the ice chambers, the spinning apparatus, the mirrored labyrinths, the whispered chants that carried subtle instruction. Emotion was layered, dissonant, a symphony of contradiction. They could feel tenderness, curiosity, and amusement even as another part of them measured response, calculated the progression of fear, and catalogued sensation. Empathy existed, but it was tempered with analysis. A friend might fall and scrape a knee, and the twins would instinctively offer care, yet simultaneously observe the body's response, noting flinches, reflexes, and the subtle tremor of panic beneath the surface. Even kindness became a measured act, a study in the effect of action upon perception. The Draytons had taught them to internalize fear, to observe it, and to administer it when appropriate. Now, the twins were practicing both lessons on themselves and each other. They began to notice that certain memories, certain shadows, certain subtle movements of light or sound could trigger echoes of past instruction, an involuntary tension in the shoulder, a flicker of awareness in the eyes, a quiet tightening of the chest. These responses, although instinctive, were catalogued and understood, becoming a private language between themselves and the household. Their minds had learned to parse terror from observation, to separate instinct from analysis, to carry emotional weight while simultaneously studying it. And yet the fracture was undeniable. The twins occasionally found themselves standing at the edge of panic, staring at nothing, hearing whispers that did not exist, replaying rituals in their minds long after the lanterns were extinguished. Sleep brought both relief and terror, as dreams blended past lessons with imagined horrors, weaving nightmares indistinguishable from memory. Despite this inner turmoil, the twins remained outwardly composed. Schoolmates, neighbors, and visitors could detect nothing unusual. Their poise, grace, and attention to decorum concealed the careful balancing act within. Lyle and Maren had become experts in the performance of normalcy, walking through the world with an eerie precision, bodies and minds trained to appear untouched while absorbing layers of terror and observation. Even the simplest interactions were filtered through this dual consciousness. A handshake, a smile, a fleeting glance, each carried an internal audit. How would the recipient react? What subtle cues might betray comprehension? What could be learned, catalogued, or predicted? And still, they retained fragments of childhood joy, fleeting sparks of unconditioned curiosity, laughter that escaped not from calculation but from pure instinct. Those moments were rare and precious, fragile reminders that the human mind, even when meticulously shaped, could not be fully controlled. These glimpses of innocence coexisted uneasily with the methodical understanding of fear. Lyle and Maren's inner world was a labyrinth of duality, joy intertwined with dread, empathy measured against observation, memory overlaid with instruction. The mind had become both canvas and instrument, capable of feeling deeply yet always monitoring and recording the experience. Evil, as the Draytons had taught, was not merely action but education. It could be passed down, codified, instilled with precision and subtlety, a curriculum that trained the mind to endure, anticipate, and participate. The twins were living proof of this philosophy. They had absorbed not only the mechanics of fear, but its psychology, its rhythm, its patterns. They understood the choreography of terror and composure, the interplay of sensation, emotion, and control. And yet this mastery came at a cost. Their perception of others was tinted with calculation. Their empathy, though real, was never fully unfiltered. They could read reactions and anticipate behavior, seeing both the person and the way that person could be shaped or observed. Their inner lives were haunted, but that haunting was silent, subtle, hidden beneath the mask of normalcy. Even laughter was tinged with the knowledge of what could be taught, what could be anticipated, what could be imposed. It was a quiet, internalized lesson in the omnipresence of observation, in the duality of experience, in the understanding that normalcy could be maintained even when the mind contained terror. This fractured awareness extended to their own bodies. Every sensation was catalogued, every shiver, every tightening of muscle, every tremor of heartbeat observed and analyzed. They had become both subject and scientist, absorbing lessons as victims, recording them as analysts. The mind, in this sense, was both instrument and classroom, shaped, studied, and disciplined under the silent guidance of their parents. And yet, despite this fracture, the twins persisted. They moved through public spaces with the grace of ordinary children, laughed with friends, and participated in routines that no outsider could question. Beneath that composure, however, lay a mind forever altered, a consciousness split between observation and experience, joy and terror, empathy and calculation. The Draytons' curriculum had succeeded in creating an intricate architecture of fear, understanding, and control, one that would define the twins' lives indefinitely. Their fractured minds were both shield and burden, a haunting reminder that the lessons of childhood, when designed to shape, mold, and instill obedience, could leave indelible marks even when the surface appeared flawless. And as the twins walked the orchard paths in the waning light, outwardly serene and ordinary, the shadow of their upbringing followed them in silence, a constant, unseen companion that would linger long after the house itself had faded into history. Mrs. Callahan had lived on the outskirts of the orchard for decades. She had seen the Draytons grow from a quiet, prosperous family into an institution of precision and careful control, and she prided herself on knowing her neighbors. But one evening, as she carried a basket of apples past the farmhouse, she glimpsed something that unsettled her in ways she could not name. Through a slightly ajar window, she saw a flicker of movement too precise, too deliberate to belong to ordinary play. Shadows danced across the walls in patterns that made no sense. Reflections multiplied and distorted, and the children's laughter, so ordinary in the daylight, took on a metallic, almost hollow resonance. She did not understand what she saw. The mind could not place it, could not name it, could not rationalize it into anything familiar. Her stomach tightened, a slow, creeping dread that had no source but demanded attention. That night she could not sleep. Images flitted across her mind, children standing perfectly still in the corners of a room, instruments she could not identify, shadows moving without explanation. She tried to dismiss it as imagination, the product of fatigue or overactive senses, yet the unease persisted, growing with every passing day. The Draytons' household, outwardly charming, had always impressed visitors with civility and meticulous care. Guests were greeted warmly, tables set immaculately, laughter offered freely. But now, in her recollection of that fleeting glimpse, Mrs. Callahan realized that appearances could be deceiving, that normalcy could mask something far darker, something methodical, precise, and almost impossible to articulate. In the days and weeks that followed, she found herself noticing small, inexplicable occurrences across the town, animals disappearing without trace, minor fires that seemed to follow no natural pattern, doors locked from the inside, though no one held a key. They were minor incidents, isolated, easily dismissed, yet each seemed connected, each seemed deliberate, yet untouchable. The Draytons continued their routines with the same careful charm, their faces and manners perfect masks that shielded every trace of cruelty. Mrs. Callahan began to understand that she had witnessed something real, something beyond ordinary comprehension. Yet she could not point to evidence, could not name the horror, could not rally the town to awareness. It was a terror without form, a threat that operated in the spaces between observation and proof. She became acutely aware of the duality of the household, the outward civility and order, and the hidden precision of cruelty, invisible yet omnipresent. Each glimpse of the twins in the orchard, each polite greeting at the fence, reminded her of the moment she had seen the impossible, the exacting choreography of fear that left no trace, yet lingered in the mind like a shadow that could not be shaken. The Draytons' evil was not loud. It did not announce itself with violence or spectacle. It was subtle, deliberate, refined to operate in the invisible spaces of perception. The community, busy with daily life, remained largely unaware, yet Mrs. Callahan carried the knowledge like a parasite in her subconscious, feeding off the denial and disbelief that surrounded her. She began to notice patterns in the behavior of neighbors as well: hesitation, unexplained unease, fleeting impressions that something was not as it seemed. Nobody could articulate it. The Draytons' perfection remained untouchable, their cruelty hidden behind charm, civility, and the meticulous routines of the household. Even the children, outwardly sweet and fragile, seemed to possess an innate understanding of the duality, moving between observation and performance with uncanny composure. Mrs. Callahan wondered if the town's denial was necessary, if the human mind required distance from such precision of evil to function. Yet the glimpses she had seen remained vivid, the mirrored reflections multiplying endlessly, the children's poised movements in response to unseen cues, the soft rhythmic motions of instruments that whispered control. She could not explain it, and that impossibility gave the Draytons their power. Evil, she realized, did not always need acknowledgement to persist. It thrived in secrecy, in control over perception, in the invisibility of its own execution. The Draytons were untouchable, not because they were clever alone, but because they had mastered the art of invisibility, of hiding methodical cruelty behind the routines of domestic life, behind charm, civility, and the ordinary. And yet, in Mrs. Callahan's mind, the memory of that single glimpse lingered like a scar. She carried it silently, unable to name it, unable to confront it, yet aware that it existed. It shaped the way she moved through the town, the way she observed the orchard, the way she perceived the ordinary gestures of her neighbors. The shadow of knowledge was heavier than fear, because it had no outlet, no form, no articulation. She was an unseen witness, a recorder of what could not be spoken, an observer of precision cruelty that could never be proven. And in that silence, the Draytons' influence spread beyond their walls, into the subconscious of the town itself, leaving traces of disquiet and suspicion that no one could fully name. Evil, the witness understood, need not roar to dominate. It could operate invisibly, feeding off disbelief, shaping perception, twisting memory, and leaving a mark long after the body had walked free, long after the ordinary world returned to routine. The Draytons were alive in the minutiae, in the gaps of perception, in the unnoticed corridors of observation. And Mrs. Callahan, silent, aware, and powerless to prove it, carried that knowledge alone, a testament to the invisible, enduring power of cruelty perfected and hidden behind civility. Years passed, and the Drayton farmhouse fell silent, its orchards overgrown, its windows dark, and its machines left to gather dust in hidden rooms. Yet the past never fully released its hold. Fragments of evidence began to emerge, discovered by accident or through quiet persistence. Journals meticulously detailing every lesson, observation, and reaction of the twins. Broken mechanical devices whose function could be guessed only through careful reconstruction. Photographs of mirrored chambers, spinning apparatuses, and ice chambers, all capturing children in poses that suggested discipline, observation, and fear. These remnants told a story that the law struggled to interpret. There were no dramatic crimes captured in a single instant, no outbursts of violence to form a clear case. What had transpired was subtle, deliberate, and methodical, a cruelty that operated within the mind, the body, and the invisible spaces between them. Judges, investigators, and historians alike wrestled with these fragments. They could catalog them, describe them, attempt to reconstruct their use, but they could not fully capture the lived experience of those who had endured them. The Draytons' cruelty had been systematic, ritualistic, almost surgical in its precision, and the law, bound by concrete proof, was ill-equipped to address harm that was invisible in execution, yet devastating in effect. The twins, now adults, had long since departed from the farmhouse, carrying with them the memories of mechanical devotion, mirrored labyrinths, whispered lessons, and silent terror. Their public lives were composed, ordinary, and polished, giving no outward sign of what had shaped them. Attempts to press charges or demand restitution faltered. Witness testimony was fragmentary, circumstantial, or entirely absent. The physical evidence, though compelling in its oddity, could not prove intent in a courtroom accustomed to more conventional forms of crime. Yet the legacy remained. Fragments of the Draytons' study of fear and control seeped into local consciousness like water into stone. The town remembered the unexplained disappearances, the minor fires, the missing animals, the locked doors, and the strange unease that had always accompanied the farmhouse. Even those who had long dismissed those memories as coincidence now recalled them with a new weight, a subtle recognition that what they had felt as suspicion or discomfort was rooted in something real. The journals revealed the scope of the Draytons' obsession. Each page documented not only the twins' reactions but also observations of neighbors, the minutiae of ordinary life recorded with the precision of a scientific study. Mechanical devices were sketched with notes on their construction, purpose, and measured effect. Symbols etched on walls and in books were catalogued and explained, a meticulous record of every ritual, every lesson, every observed tremor of body or mind. Yet despite these revelations, justice remained elusive. There were no clear victims willing or able to testify, no laws equipped to prosecute trauma meticulously administered over years in private. The Draytons' absence was complete. They had vanished into history, leaving only these fragments as testimony to a carefully concealed curriculum of fear. And in that absence, questions persisted. How could such meticulous cruelty exist undetected for so long? How could innocence and civility mask a deliberate, sustained orchestration of terror? What responsibility did those who sensed, even dimly, the horrors have? And how could society reconcile with the invisible yet enduring imprint left on the twins and the community? Local historians pieced together accounts from neighbors, photographs, and the journals, creating exhibitions and small articles that attempted to explain the house, the orchard, the hidden mechanisms, and the deliberate training of the mind. Visitors would stand before the remnants of mirrors, chairs, and ice devices, tracing their function with fingers or eyes, trying to imagine the experience of those subjected to them. The town's collective memory shifted. Where once there had been only vague unease, now there was recognition. The Draytons had been architects of a quiet, systematic horror, operating in plain sight, hidden by charm, civility, and the ordinariness of domestic life. Philosophically, the story of the Draytons challenged the way people thought about evil. It suggested that malevolence need not be loud, that cruelty could thrive in silence, and that the mind, carefully trained, could endure horrors imperceptible to the world outside. The Draytons' legacy was a warning that evil could be cultivated as a curriculum, passed on, and concealed behind normalcy, leaving effects long after the perpetrators themselves had disappeared. Even as physical evidence decayed and eyewitness accounts became faint or fragmented, the lessons persisted in memory, in the subtle hesitations of those who remembered, in the lingering unease that never fully dissipated. And so the Draytons remained, both absent and present, a haunting study in methodical horror. The orchards grew wild, the house settled into quiet ruin, and the devices, journals, and photographs were preserved in the care of historians and archivists. Yet the deeper lesson, the most enduring imprint, lived in the minds of those who understood that evil, perfectly concealed, leaves traces that cannot be erased, a shadow in memory, a shiver at the edge of perception, a quiet doubt in the trust of appearances. In Pennsylvania, the Drayton story lingered as both mystery and cautionary tale. Historians, neighbors, and descendants of those who had glimpsed the hidden world often reflected on the fragile boundary between civility and cruelty, between observation and participation, between childhood innocence and meticulously cultivated terror. And as viewers learn this history, the question remains haunting and unresolved. What is left unseen in the world today, and could such precision of cruelty, hidden behind normalcy, arise again? Long after the Drayton farmhouse had fallen into ruin and the orchard had returned to wilderness, historians, psychologists, and curious observers began to piece together the echoes of the family's hidden world. Journals, photographs, and fragments of mechanical devices offered glimpses into a meticulous system of cruelty. Yet what captured the most attention was not the instruments or the rituals themselves, but the way evil had existed unnoticed in plain sight. Scholars noted how the Draytons had disguised horror beneath ordinary domesticity, creating an environment where charm, civility, and appearance masked a profound, deliberate malevolence. They studied the twins' lives, tracing the subtle but unmistakable effects of their upbringing, acute awareness, the ability to observe and measure others' responses, a dual consciousness of empathy and analysis, and the quiet fractures that persisted beneath composure. Psychological reflections focused on how such environments could shape the human mind. The twins had internalized fear as education, terror as instruction, observation as survival. Modern science attempted to understand the mechanisms of control and compliance, the ways in which rituals, repetition, and meticulously applied discipline could produce both resilience and trauma simultaneously. Scholars debated whether the Draytons' methodology could ever have been identified earlier, or whether human perception and denial had allowed the horror to flourish unseen. Townsfolk recounted memories that once seemed trivial: a missing hen, a minor fire, doors locked from the inside, and now interpreted them as fragments of a larger, systematic cruelty. The collective reflection was sobering. Evil does not always announce itself with violence or spectacle. It can thrive in silence, in measured control, in the careful construction of appearances. Even ordinary gestures, smiles, and routines can conceal deliberate malevolence. The Draytons' cruelty became a case study in the subtlety of human harm, demonstrating that the most dangerous lessons are often those taught invisibly, in private, and without immediate consequence. Beyond academic interest, the story of the Draytons prompted moral contemplation. How many families, how many households might hide routines of cruelty or control behind normality? How often do communities mistake innocence for safety, charm for trustworthiness, order for morality? The Draytons' case revealed that vigilance requires more than observation of overt actions. It requires attention to the hidden, the unnoticed, and the patterns of behavior that leave psychological traces even when physical evidence is absent. Modern exhibits of the Draytons' remnants, photographs of the mirrored labyrinth, the spinning device, the ice chamber, journals filled with careful notation, were presented not as sensational curiosities but as cautionary artifacts. Visitors were encouraged to reflect, to consider how the ordinary could conceal the extraordinary, how silence could be as potent as sound, how normalcy could serve as a shield for systematic cruelty. Psychologists emphasized the duality experienced by the twins, how laughter and terror, empathy and analysis, joy and dread could coexist, intertwined by years of subtle, deliberate instruction. These reflections provided insight not only into the Draytons' cruelty, but into human adaptability, resilience, and vulnerability. The story reached beyond historical interest, raising questions about the nature of evil itself, how it grows unnoticed, how it cultivates obedience, how it leverages appearances to perpetuate harm. The moral weight was inescapable. Audiences were invited to confront the possibility that cruelty need not be allowed to endure, that innocence is not always a shield, and that human perception, constrained by expectation and trust, can be deceived by precision, patience, and methodical planning. Even decades later, the Draytons' influence lingered in the subconscious of the town, in the quiet unease of those who had glimpsed fragments of the truth, and in the haunting lessons recorded in journals and photographs. The question posed by these reflections was uncomfortable, unanswerable in concrete terms, yet unavoidable. How often do we mistake innocence for safety, charm for trust, civility for virtue? The answer remained elusive because the danger was invisible until it had taken root, leaving marks not in walls or floors but in the mind itself. Scholars, historians, and visitors were left to reckon with this intangible legacy, to confront the subtle ways evil can shape behavior, perception, and understanding without ever announcing itself. The Drayton story was no longer merely about a single family, a single orchard, or even the mechanical devices and rituals they had employed. It had become a meditation on the nature of hidden cruelty, the methods by which the human mind can be molded without violence that is visible, and the fragility of trust in the ordinary. Exhibits ended with hushed rooms and dim lighting, designed to evoke reflection rather than horror, leaving audiences with a profound sense of unease. It was a quiet, intellectual terror, the kind that lingers long after one leaves a museum or closes a book. Visitors were compelled to look inward, to question how easily normality can conceal intent, How much of the world operates under the assumption that evil is obvious when it often thrives in silence? And in that reflection lay the final lesson of the Drayton story, that evil, perfectly concealed, leaves echoes that persist in memory, perception, and culture, even when its architects have vanished. As historians closed their journals and psychologists concluded their studies, the orchard remained silent, the house in ruins, and the town largely unaware of the subtle currents that had once flowed beneath its daily life. Yet for those who studied, observed, or remembered, the question remained, haunting and unresolved. How often do we mistake innocence for safety, and in that misjudgment, allow the quietest evils to flourish?